I have some good news for you, and that is that it's looking like we're going to get out of here early tonight. Unless I just start talking really slowly. Before I start my message today, though, I do have something else I'd like to just put out there because we have time and because I'm standing here and you're out there and I have attention. So, in my life skills class, I teach, or I try to teach, a little something about etiquette. Things you should avoid so that you don't come across as being rude. For example, it's not good etiquette to answer your cell phone in the middle of a conversation you're having with an actual human being. It's not good etiquette to answer your cell phone when you're sitting in the middle of a bench seat in a pickup truck and force the driver and the passenger to just sit there and wait while you finish your conversation. It's not good etiquette to try to pay at a grocery store with a check, but not have your checkbook and your pen out and ready before the cashier tells you how much money it costs you. The person behind you is going to get really annoyed by that. And it's really bad etiquette to run up to a complete stranger and just randomly punch them in the throat. Don't do that. It might be perceived as rude. I've noticed over the past few months, though, that there is a little bit of etiquette that we could stand to learn right here in this room. And I'm telling you this now because I know you guys well enough to know that none of you mean anything rude by it. But I just want to say this, and this is coming from a guy who grew up in the church. My dad actually just retired last week from 37 years as a pastor. And so I literally grew up in the church building. I've done everything wrong that there is to do wrong in a church building. Don't let your imaginations wander. But one thing that I've noticed happens here from time to time is that some of you decide that right in the middle of a message is a pretty good time for you to get up and go use the restroom or go get a drink. And I would like to challenge you to avoid that from here on out because, for one, it's a little bit hurtful to the speaker, and for two, it's distracting for every person sitting behind you. And I've been sitting at the back of this chapel for 5 years now, so I always sit when you guys do it. So I just ask you to think about that. It's an etiquette thing. Please don't leave in the middle of a message. Now, if you're sick, or you're crying, or you're dying, yes, by all means, go. But if you can wait, please do. Now, how many of you really have to go to the bathroom right now? Right? Okay. That's all I'm going to say about that. Now we'll start with the real thing. Valentine's Day. I know what some of you want. You want to hear our story. I knew the moment that I saw her that I was in love. A love greater than any love in existence. One that would be written about and sung about and eventually animated into a Disney movie. Right? Is that what you want to hear? No. That's not what you're getting today. Even though that basically is what happened. I also know that I'm going to try to fit a lot of information into a small amount of space. And I don't mean your heads. I mean the amount of time that I have to convey this. So I can't be exhaustive, and but I still hope that I plant some seeds here that take root, and that eventually, when this stuff becomes applicable to you, you are able to refer back to it. Some of what I suggest today might not fit with your current theology. And I want to challenge you not to dismiss it outright just because it's not what you've heard before, but also don't just accept it without careful thought and prayer and consideration. Because I think what I'm going to share, if you're able to track with me, is going to be very important for the rest of your lives. When I was 4 years old, I was riding home from church one Sunday afternoon in the back of my family station wagon with my sister and my parents in the front seats. And it was fairly quiet, and then suddenly I exclaimed, to no one in particular. I want to be God. Bewildered, my parents asked, why? Well, Josh is Superman, and Lindsay is Wonder Woman. I want to be God. Now, I admit my idea of God's character wasn't that developed at that time, but at least I knew in the range of superheroes, I knew who was the best of the best. But isn't it true that from time to time all of us wish that we were God, or at least that we knew what God was thinking? We struggle constantly with understanding why things happen the way that they do. We love God, we want to make Him happy, but sometimes we don't know how. If we were God, we'd know what He wanted, and understanding the things of life wouldn't always be so confusing. Some people think that finding God's will works something like this. Let me sound here. The example was in finding a spouse, but people apply this to all sorts of things, thinking that there is some perfect, exactly right choice, right in the center of God's will, and that as we move outwards from that center, you progressively become less and less accurate, and your choice is less and less good, according to God's standards. And so it is that trying to figure out the will of God can become a stressful ordeal. Where does God want me to go to college? What does God want me to do with my job? Who does God want me to marry? If I want to please God, how will He feel if I make the wrong decision? What makes this even more difficult is that most often we don't even know what is in the middle of the target that we're aiming for. And this can cause a lot of stress and anxiety, especially if you find yourself in a situation where in hindsight you think maybe you already made a wrong decision and are therefore living outside of the will of God. What do you do if you follow one educational path, one career path, invested time and money, and then you get this feeling or this concern that that's not what God wanted for you? What if you get married and then you find your soulmate somewhere else? Are you stuck living a second-rate life because you misread the cues? Some people develop methods of determining the will of God using some pretty creative techniques. Have you ever asked God for a sign or set out a fleece? Okay, if a bird flies in that door in the next 30 seconds, then God wants me to have pizza tonight for dinner. Have you ever decided that God told you to do something, yet you never actually heard His voice? The problem is that there's no real biblical warrant for this approach, and therefore no set of rules to assign a specific meaning to any circumstance. You could use any circumstance to justify any decision. If she brushes her hair with her left hand, it means she loves me. Was that feeling that you had, that rumbling of your spirit, the Lord? Or was it last night's enchiladas? Scripture has a few examples of this. In John 9, Jesus' disciples saw a blind man and asked, "Who has sinned that this man has become blind?" They assumed that it was a sin and this was a punishment for that. And Jesus said, "Nobody sinned." He corrected them in that. In Luke 13, a tower collapsed and 18 people were killed. And many thought that God's judgment had fallen on these people. But Jesus refuted their faulty reasoning. And I'd like to suggest to you that while God is perfectly capable of giving specific instruction regarding our decisions through obvious signs, it is the exception rather than the rule. Let me say that again. God is perfectly capable of doing this. I don't want to negate any experiences that you have where you are confident that type of thing is happening. But it's the exception rather than the rule. Even in the Bible, we can easily recall the times when God has spoken to His people, either directly or through an angel or a vision. Burning bush, Balaam, Mary and Joseph and the angel, Paul on the road to Damascus. And each time it happens, it's 100% clear that it's from God. There's no question. And that's why I have a problem with people who say they felt God was telling them to do this or that. Well, I don't want to belittle their faith or the validity of their assertions. I can't help but ask myself, how do you know? What did He sound like? What I'm going to talk to you about today comes from a man who I admire greatly. He literally wrote the book on decision-making in the will of God, and it's called Decision-Making in the Will of God. And his name is Gary Friesen, and he co-authored this book with a man I admire even more, who, on page 293, wrote, "Now Michael Benjamin has arrived. He looks like elder material, though it is a bit too early to tell. He wrote that in 1980. I'm Michael Benjamin. I was one. And the author is my father. So, hopefully I know what it is I'm talking about here. The book talks first about the idea of commanded and non-commanded decisions. Basically, there are a lot of things that we as Christians are morally commanded to do because God says it. He tells us in the Bible. And so our first rule for making decisions is that where there is a command, we need to obey it. The Bible tells you to do it, do it. If God speaks to you in a voice, listen, do it. But the Bible can't cover every single scenario we ever face. And there are many areas where there are no specific commands given. We'll call these non-commanded decisions. In those instances, if there is no command, we have the freedom and responsibility to choose, so long as that decision abides by the moral will of God. In other words, as long as we're not committing a sin, we can choose freely between multiple options. This changes the illustration from my video from a target, where we're trying to get the exact center of God's moral will and get as close to that as possible, to maybe something more like a yard with a fence, where God's moral will is there's a border around it separating the moral and the immoral, and as long as you're inside of that, you're free to go anywhere in the yard that you like. Opens up a lot more options, and it relieves us of the fear that we missed, or that we were kind of okay, but could have been a little bit better. Take choosing where to go to college, for example. When I graduated in high school, I had a few options. I was thinking maybe I'd go to Wheaton, which is in Illinois, or I would look into a college in Oregon, which is my home state, called George Fox University. And I thought about some secular colleges too. I drove through Stanford and looked, but it was intimidating, so I kept going in. But I had a few options. With this idea here, there wasn't concern in my mind that if I chose the wrong of those colleges, that God would not be with me. I knew that regardless, so long as I didn't check my morals at the door when I walked through the gates of a secular college, God was going to be with me, and He was going to support my decision. Now, if you're still paying attention, you might be asking yourself at this point, where does that leave God in the decision-making process? If we're free to choose anything, then what does he have to do with it at all? How do we balance free will with an omniscient God, a God who knows everything that was and is and will happen in the entire universe? And that's a question that has troubled theologians for millennia, so obviously I'm going to fully address it to your satisfaction right here and now. Yes, God is involved. More than we can ever fully comprehend. James 1:5 says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. As you need to make a decision, ask God, and he will help you. And so that says to us that where there is freedom and there is no command, God also gives us the wisdom to choose. He will help us with our decisions. We're not out there all on our own. There's another aspect of God's will that's very important, and that is God's sovereign will. And it's defined as God's secret plan that determines everything that happens in the universe. God's secret plan that determines everything that happens in the universe. Now, while most of the Bible passages that talk about God's will are referring to his moral will and what he wants us to do, what's good and bad, there are some that refer to his sovereign will. In Romans 1:9-13, Paul writes, God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you. I long to see you that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have the harvest among you, just as I have had among other Gentiles. Now, there are other instances in Paul's writing where he was directly commanded by God to go somewhere or do something. The call to Macedonia, he had a vision. It was clearly God. The road to Damascus, it was clearly God. But here, Paul wants to go somewhere, and if God wills it, he will, but he said he was prevented from doing so for a while. You know, we say God willing, and we say inshallah, and what we mean by that is that I hope this happens as long as God is able to use it for his purposes, as long as it fits with God's sovereign will. And there are a few things about God's sovereign will that I want to point out here to help flesh this out. The first thing is that God's sovereign will is certain. It's certain of fulfillment. There is nothing we can do, no decision we can make or not make that will ultimately prevent this from being completed. God will fulfill his will whether we cooperate or not. The second is that it is detailed. God's will covers from the infinitesimal to the intergalactic. Ephesians 1:11 says, God accomplishes all things according to the counsel of his will. The third is that it is hidden. Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong to the Lord. This means that you can't predict it, you can't invoke it. There are times when we see evidence of it after it happens, and I've talked to you about this before, what I call fingerprints, where God shows that he has been intimately involved in our lives and in the decisions we've made. But we don't get to find out the full scope of the story this side of heaven. Fourth, it is supreme. While we have freedom of choice, God works ahead of, behind, around, over, under, through, and in spite of us. He is able to balance our free will with his sovereign will without being a puppet master and controlling everything we do. How? He's God. He's God. The last thing that I want to mention is that the sovereign will of God is good. We've been through this discussion before. The problem of evil, how can good things happen? Or how can a good God let bad things happen? We know it's the result of the fall, a byproduct of free will, the ability to choose poorly, and consequences of other people's bad choices. We've already established that God does not necessarily want sin to happen, but can still redeem a situation in spite of sin. And that's a good thing, isn't it? Because if not, we're all in big, 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 big trouble. I will say this. Let's skip those, or get those. To talk about the sovereign will of God being good. To sum it up, and this is from something my dad's writing, the most heinous crime in human history, the willful murder of the Son of God, Israel's Messiah, actually accomplished the central requirement of God's glorious plan of redemption. If the worst thing that ever happened could also be the best thing that ever happened, everything else is a footnote. That's how we know that God's sovereignty is good. And then Os Guinness, who's a famous theologian, sums it up by saying this: as believers, we cannot always know why, but we can always know why we trust God, who knows why, and this makes all the difference. So, where there is a command, we must obey. Where there is no command, we have the freedom and responsibility to choose. Where there is no command, God gives us wisdom to choose. And when we have chosen what is moral and wise, we must trust the sovereign God to work all the details together for good. Once you make your decision, if it is wise, if it is moral, give it over to God. Don't worry about it. He's got it. Now, let's apply this to the topic of marriage. This is, after all, Valentine's Day. Is getting married a commanded or non-commanded decision? Does God tell us we have to get married? No, He doesn't. In fact, in Matthew 19, Jesus makes mention of people who choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul gives more advice about marriage than anywhere else in the whole Bible, Paul says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, it's actually probably better for you not to get married, kind of like me. If you have to get married, go ahead. But basically, the point he's trying to make is that whether you get married or not, you need to concern yourself with the Lord's affairs. So marriage is not a commanded decision based on what we discussed here. It means that we have the freedom and the responsibility not only to choose who we marry, but to choose if we should marry at all. I never really liked Valentine's Day messages. And while some of you do, and some of you would go so far as to enroll in a class that's a semester long, just to find out how the teacher met his wife, they always make me uncomfortable. Because while it's fun to share stories about romance and love with others who have similar experiences, I know that the majority of us in this room are not romantically involved at the moment. And I think about how it might come across, especially to those who aren't involved, but maybe wish that they were. And I know I'm not the best person to make this point. I'm happily married. And maybe that fact alone will prevent you from hearing me as I represent another perspective, but hopefully you'll overlook that and you'll hear this. I believe that the Western Christian Church has done a bad job at acknowledging and even promoting the value of a single person. We give messages about marriage, and we make it out to be the ultimate prize. We make it seem like a reward for good behavior and for waiting patiently. If you behave yourself all those years leading up to marriage, God's going to reward you with a husband or a wife just at the right time. Just you wait. And we, hopefully unintentionally, we make single people feel like they haven't lived, that they haven't made it, and it's just a matter of time. One day we'll see. But in the meantime, you are incomplete. You're a half person. You're second class. This drives me crazy. Marriage is not the ultimate goal. Relationship with God is. And whether you are single or married, you have an equal opportunity to achieve that goal. And in some ways, as Paul indicated, it's actually easier to serve God as a single person than as a married person. My sister is 35 years old and single. She and I talked earlier this week when I told her I was going to be giving this message, and I asked for her input on it. And she shared with me that when she was younger, she used to look at the older women in her church and think to herself, those in the 30s, 40s, 50s who were single, and think, if I could figure out what they did wrong, I could avoid it. Another part of her appreciated their example their ability to serve God faithfully in spite of being single. But her attitude has since shifted. Even though a part of her desire is to be married one day, she also recognizes the challenges inherent in even the best marriages. And she is now genuinely okay with the idea that being single for the rest of her life is okay. And in fact, maybe even preferable. She has put her trust in God's sovereignty over her life. She has embraced her singleness and used it to create opportunities for ministry and relationships she would not have had as a married person. And she enjoys the freedom that she has. She realizes that she has the ability to serve God faithfully, not in spite of, but because of being single. And because she doesn't yet know how her story is going to end, she even prays for her future children. Although she has tended more towards the possibility that they be stepchildren. And she will continue to make decisions that are wise and moral, open to either possibility, singleness or marriage. But she trusts in the sovereignty of God and commits to serving Him in whatever state her relationship is in. She also told me that whenever she prays for her potential future children, she also prays for the children God has already placed in her life. The children of dear friends, the children at her church. And that's a distinctive contribution she makes to the kingdom of God. As do other single adults all over the world. They love other people's kids. And I hope you students are aware of the love that we as staff have for you. Whether we're married or single, whether we have kids of our own or not, we relish in the opportunity to love on you guys. Finally, my sister told me, God doesn't promise us that He'll give us a spouse. He doesn't promise He won't. But He will always give each of us people to love. Everything is grace. Everything is grace. So whether you are single by choice or by circumstance, or if you know someone who is single, don't think of it as a transitional phase in a life that will be better only once it's completed and coupled up. Love the ones around you and acknowledge the value of each individual as they are and as they serve God and help build His kingdom. And as you go about your lives with a desire to please God, don't base your decisions on signs or feelings, nor live in fear that you may have missed God's call. When we have chosen what is moral and wise, we must trust the sovereign God to work out all the details together for good. End of Psalm.